Prince William appeared on Heart FM and somehow found himself debating scones. At its most basic level, that is the entire story. A radio segment. Cream first or jam first? The argument Britain has been having for generations and will probably continue having forever. William revealed that Queen Elizabeth always preferred the cream first. The hosts produced trays of scones and became genuinely invested in the discussion. William laughed his way through it with the kind of ease that comes from not having to constantly manage how you appear in every moment. The clip quickly spread across social media because it was exactly the sort of thing people enjoy sharing. A future king, relaxed and amusing, talking about something completely removed from institutional responsibility, public duty, or the monarchy as an institution. Then, not long afterward, Meghan's As Ever brand shared polished footage featuring warm scones, cream, jam, and an elegantly arranged British tea setting. The internet, being the internet, noticed almost immediately. Meghan Markle's creepy Prince William stalking has just been uncovered, and what it supposedly demonstrates, according to critics, is that she remains completely fixated on the other royals. Tonight, we're looking at the scone moment, what it reveals about the broader contrast between these two public personas in 2025, the William and Aston Villa phone call that became its own viral story during the same week, and the larger structural question highlighted by this comparison. Because the issue isn't really about scones. It's about whether a brand built around independence from the royal world has actually achieved that independence, or whether it remains, in the ways that matter commercially, tied to the very story it was meant to leave behind. Let's begin with the Heart FM clip because the context matters far more than the headline suggests. William was participating in a lighthearted segment centered on one of Britain's most enduringly divisive questions. Does the cream go on before the jam, or the jam before the cream? For anyone outside Britain, a little context is necessary. The Cornish position insists on jam first, followed by cream. The Devonians maintain that cream comes first and jam afterward. Both sides defend their views with a level of conviction suggesting they've never seriously entertained the possibility that the other side might have a point. These opinions have been held passionately across generations and argued with complete sincerity at village fetes, tea rooms, family gatherings, and online comment sections for as long as anyone can remember. As cultural controversies go, it is entirely harmless, which is precisely why it works so well as a public moment for a royal attempting to project approachability. William revealed that Queen Elizabeth always put the cream on first. He said it with warmth and with the confidence of someone citing an authority figure who is both deeply loved and effectively beyond dispute. The late Queen's preference is not an easy argument to challenge. The hosts challenged it anyway. Trays appeared. The discussion became delightfully chaotic, with people talking over one another and waving scones around, which is exactly the correct atmosphere for this particular debate. William laughed throughout in a way that felt natural rather than managed. He was clearly enjoying himself. That enjoyment was completely visible, and that visibility is what made the clip resonate. He came across as approachable, quick-witted, and entirely comfortable in the moment. It's the specific kind of public presence that generates the sort of coverage this clip received: warm, widely shared, and broadly appreciated by audiences who don't normally spend much time following royal news. The clip spread because it was amusing and because William appeared as an actual person rather than a public figure trying to perform relatability. The video gained traction. Major British media outlets covered it. Royal fan accounts reposted it, comment sections filled with people rehashing the cream versus jam debate in real time, citing regional traditions, family recipes, and their own deeply held opinions. By virtually every available engagement metric, it was an extremely effective piece of public visibility. And it worked precisely because it wasn't created to be effective. It was created to be enjoyable. That distinction matters, and the difference is visible in the way audiences respond to it. Then Meghan's As Ever account shared its scone content, warm lighting, an elegant table setting, cream, jam, and a carefully curated British tea aesthetic, polished, deliberate, and clearly designed with visual communication in mind. The timing immediately attracted attention. William's scone discussion had already been generating positive coverage and social engagement for several days. The As Ever post entered that ongoing conversation, carrying many of the same elements: the same central food item, the same cultural tradition, the same British aesthetic framework, only translated from a spontaneous radio debate into carefully produced lifestyle brand imagery. The thing is, Angela, There is nothing particularly British about this woman. There is nothing inherently royal about this woman. When she was actually part of that world, she openly disliked much of it. If Hollywood Today is bringing you the complete story while other channels leave out key details, hitting the like button helps us reach a wider audience. It costs nothing, but it genuinely makes a difference. Now, let's be careful about what critics were actually saying, because the online discussion moved in several directions at once, and it's worth separating those different arguments. The first and most straightforward point concerned timing. The argument was that Meghan's content appeared while William's scone segment was still receiving significant social media attention, and that the overlap in subject matter was too specific for some observers to dismiss as simple coincidence. Scones are not just a generic lifestyle content item. They are a distinctly British cultural reference that had just become closely associated with a highly positive public moment involving the future king. The as ever post entered that existing conversation rather than appearing in isolation. A second criticism focused on aesthetic presentation. Observers argued that the visual style of the as ever scone footage leaned heavily into traditional British tea culture, the carefully curated tables, elegant lighting, and refinement signaling imagery often associated with classic British prestige and, by extension, the aristocratic and royal circles connected to it. Critics suggested that this aesthetic choice creates a notable tension with the story the 2020 departure was intended to tell and has continued to tell publicly ever since. A charming interview featuring Prince William had just highlighted Queen Elizabeth II's preferred answer to the Great British Scone debate. The public narrative surrounding the departure from royal life was always framed around building something new, something independent, and something that would not rely on the visual language of the institution being left behind. To critics, the as-ever scone imagery looked very much like that same visual language, simply translated from a royal setting into a commercial one. A third argument was broader and more structural, one that has developed gradually over several years. Critics contend that a recurring pattern exists in which the brand receives its strongest engagement and most substantial coverage, not when it operates entirely on its own terms, but when it intersects with royal themes, royal imagery, or stories involving specific members of the royal family. The scone episode fits neatly into that framework. The aspect that generated the most discussion was not the product itself, but its perceived connection to a William-related moment. William, what do you do? Think carefully. I love that I'm suddenly the authority on scones. I can only tell you what I learned from my grandmother, and she would definitely have put the cream on first. Oh, she did? Yeah. Well, there you have it. That's the Devonian way. Cream first, jam on top. If that observation is correct, and much of the coverage surrounding as ever over recent months suggests there may be some truth to it, it points toward a specific and somewhat uncomfortable commercial. Reality. The brand appears to attract its highest levels of visibility and discussion when it is closest to the very institution from which it was supposed to be independent. In this context, independence seems to reduce attention rather than generate it. That is not an easy reality for a brand whose central public identity was built around independence. Subscribe to Hollywood Today and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was it deliberate strategy, coincidence, or something somewhere in between? The Angela Levin angle adds another layer to the discussion. Levin, who has spent years researching and writing about both the Sussexes and the wider royal family, offered her interpretation of the as-ever scone content with her usual directness. In her view, the repeated use of British-inspired tea culture imagery, refined presentation styles, floral displays, and carefully arranged service settings represents more than occasional references. She sees these choices as part of a recurring pattern that reflects an ongoing connection to the imagery of an institution from which the brand is supposedly independent. Levin's broader argument, one she has made repeatedly over the years and revisited following the scone discussion, is that Meghan struggled with certain aspects of royal hierarchy. More specifically, she argues that the structure placing Catherine in a formally senior position as the wife of the heir, regardless of personal popularity, celebrity status, or media influence, was particularly difficult to navigate. Whether that interpretation is accurate or whether it stretches beyond the available evidence is something audiences can decide for themselves. Cream first, jam second. Within hours, Meghan Markle had decided she was going to turn that into a little promotional moment for her business. What this does is place the scone discussion within a much larger ongoing debate concerning the relationship between the Sussex brand and the royal world it officially left behind. The conversation also expanded into product promotion during the same period, including references to family preferences that appeared in one of the brand's marketing videos. Critics argued that bringing personal family details into commercial product promotion creates a tension with the Sussex household's long-established emphasis on privacy. Supporters responded that casually mentioning which flavors different family members enjoy is not a breach of privacy at all, but simply a normal and relatable element of lifestyle content. That debate highlights a broader challenge: maintaining a consistent public stance on privacy while operating a lifestyle brand that is, by its very nature, built around selective personal disclosure. Now, let's turn to Aston Villa because it happened during the same week, and the contrast it created became a significant part of the wider royal commentary. Aston Villa won their match. William, whose support for the club has been publicly documented for years, was there and was filmed celebrating with completely genuine enthusiasm. He could be seen recording the crowd, cheering alongside fellow supporters, and fully immersed in the experience in the way football so often pulls people into the moment. The footage quickly circulated online, partly because Villa's victory was newsworthy in its own right, and partly because William's reaction felt so open, visible, and infectious. Then viewers noticed something else. During the celebration, William's phone appeared to ring. He looked at it. He declined the call. Then he immediately returned to celebrating. That 3-second interaction became a viral talking point completely separate from the match itself. Comment sections across Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms rapidly filled with jokes and increasingly imaginative theories about who might have been calling the future king in the middle of a football celebration and why the call apparently wasn't important enough to answer. The speculation was humorous, creative, and widely shared. Memes spread quickly. The moment developed a life of its own entirely independent of the game. What made the Villa footage interesting beyond its entertainment value was what it revealed about William's current public image and the particular sense of authenticity it communicated. He wasn't performing relatability for the benefit of a communication strategy. He was simply at a football match watching his team win and reacting the way supporters react when their team wins, filming, cheering, and fully engaged in the experience rather than consciously managing an image of being engaged in the experience. The ignored phone call resonated because it felt instantly familiar. Almost everyone has dismissed a call while caught up in something they didn't want to interrupt. The fact that the occasion happened to be a football victory celebration made it more relatable, not less. It was a human moment first and a royal moment second. Many commentators placed the two events side by side during the same week. William at the football, laughing, celebrating, and dismissing calls while clearly living in the moment. Meghan's As Ever account posting beautifully styled scone footage featuring cream, jam, and a carefully curated British tea setting, lit, framed, and presented for maximum visual appeal. Neither approach is inherently wrong. Lifestyle brands are expected to be polished. Football celebrations are expected to be spontaneous. But they communicate very different things about the person behind them and about that person's relationship to the moment being shown. One feels like a person living life while occasionally being filmed. The other feels like a person presenting a carefully constructed version of life for a particular audience to consume. That distinction became the foundation for much of the week's discussion. What makes this episode genuinely interesting beyond the immediate scone debate is what it may suggest about the long-term positioning of the Sussex brand and the sustainability of the original idea upon which it was built. When the departure from royal life took place in 2020, it was publicly framed as a form of liberation, a liberation from institutional constraints, a liberation from a hierarchy that formally placed William and Catherine above Harry and Meghan in every ceremonial and public setting, a liberation from aspects of palace life that were described as restrictive or harmful. The promise of the California chapter was explicit. It would be different. It would operate on its own terms. The brand being built would stand independently and would not need to rely on royal connections to justify its commercial relevance. 5 years later, many of the brand's most discussed moments continue to emerge in close proximity to the royal world it left behind. The scone imagery appears alongside William's scone discussion. Debates about royal hierarchy re-emerge in the coverage. British visual themes that critics associate with royal prestige continue to appear throughout the brand's aesthetic presentation. The conversations that generate the strongest engagement around As Ever are often the ones that contain some royal connection. Angela Levin's interpretation of this pattern, offered during commentary surrounding the scone discussion, is worth examining carefully, even if one ultimately disagrees with her conclusions. Over many years of royal coverage, Levin has consistently argued that Meghan struggled with certain aspects of the royal hierarchy and found parts of that structure particularly difficult to navigate. More specifically, it was the reality that Catherine's position as the wife of the heir meant she would always occupy a formally senior place within the institution, regardless of celebrity status, public visibility, or the size of anyone's media profile at a given moment. William and Catherine were structurally the senior couple within the royal hierarchy. Harry and Meghan were the junior couple. That arrangement was never negotiable. It was not something that could be altered through public popularity, charitable initiatives, media attention, or strategic brand management, because it was determined by succession and birth order rather than by any factor the Sussexes could influence. Whether that particular psychological tension ultimately played a role in the decision to leave is a separate question. Importantly, Levin's broader observation that the brand continues drawing upon imagery and cultural associations closely tied to the royal world does not depend on accepting that psychological interpretation in order to stand on its own. The imagery simply appears rooted in a certain aesthetic tradition of British prestige culture. Candlelit tea settings, fine china, carefully arranged cream and jam presentations that belong to a very specific social and cultural environment. And historically, that visual register is one the royal family has occupied more visibly, more consistently, and more recognizably than almost anyone else in the public imagination. The privacy discussion adds another layer worth considering. Throughout various promotional efforts during this period, as ever incorporated casual references to family preferences, favorite flavors, household habits, and glimpses of what the family table might look like during an ordinary weekend. Critics argued that for a household which has repeatedly emphasized privacy, especially concerning the children, weaving those kinds of personal details into commercial marketing creates a noticeable tension. Supporters pushed back. They argued that mentioning someone's favorite flavor in a cooking or lifestyle video hardly constitutes a violation of privacy. The disagreement reflects a broader challenge that comes with operating a lifestyle brand while simultaneously presenting privacy as a core principle. Lifestyle brands are built on selective personal disclosure. The model depends on revealing enough of one's life to make it appear engaging, aspirational, and worthy of attention. Claiming strict privacy while also running a lifestyle brand creates a structural contradiction that never fully resolves itself. As a result, every time a personal or family detail appears in promotional material, the same question resurfaces. Where exactly is the line? And is that line being applied consistently, or does it shift depending on what is being marketed? The Memorial Day timing added another element that critics were quick to notice. The as-ever scone content appeared during an American holiday weekend when most people in the United States were attending barbecues, outdoor gatherings, and family events, rather than participating in British-style tea traditions. Some observers pointed to the contrast between the holiday atmosphere and the imagery being presented. Whether that represents a strategic mistake or simply an unfortunate coincidence depends largely on how much intentionality one believes existed behind the posting schedule. What the entire Scone Week demonstrated with unusual clarity was something that previous months of as-ever coverage had already been suggesting more gradually. The conversation surrounding the brand continues to be shaped more by royal context than by anything the brand is generating entirely on its own. William's cream-first revelation produced several days of positive coverage, driven by its own momentum. Meghan's scone imagery generated attention largely because it entered a conversation that William's moment had already created. The most discussed aspect of the footage was not the footage itself. It was its perceived relationship to William's appearance. For a lifestyle brand attempting to establish its own identity, momentum, and commercial presence, that is arguably the more significant takeaway from everything that happened that week. The central question is not whether the timing was intentional. It is not whether the visual choices reflected a calculated strategy or simply emerged naturally from the brand's preferred aesthetic. The larger question is whether the brand has reached a point where it can generate its own cultural momentum. Can something from as ever stand on its own and create a wave of interest that does not rely on a royal-adjacent narrative to sustain it? Based on the events of the Scone Week and on the pattern established by several months of as-ever coverage, the answer appears to be not yet. The brand's most engaged moments continue to require that surrounding context. The stories that travel furthest continue to find a royal connection somewhere within the content and pull that thread. There are two possible interpretations of this dynamic, and they are not necessarily contradictory. The first is that, as ever, genuinely depends on proximity to the royal story in order to generate sustained public engagement. In that reading, the audience most consistently attracted to the brand is also the audience invested in the broader Sussex and royal narrative, and the brand has, either consciously or unconsciously, positioned itself towards serving that audience. The second interpretation is that much of this pattern is being created by the media environment rather than by the brand itself. In that reading, commentary surrounding As Ever naturally gravitates toward royal comparisons because the people producing much of that commentary are professionally focused on the royal family. As a result, virtually any lifestyle content Meghan releases will be viewed through that framework regardless of what the content actually contains. The reality is that both explanations are probably true to some degree at the same time. The honest answer is that determining the exact balance between them is extremely difficult from the outside. In fact, the people operating the brand themselves may not be entirely certain where that balance lies. What can be observed, however, is the pattern of which moments consistently generate the highest levels of attention and engagement throughout the Sussex brand ecosystem. And that pattern repeatedly points back toward royal proximity rather than away from it. That observation does not depend on any particular theory about motivation or intent. The question raised by the Scone Week is whether this dynamic functions as a commercial advantage or a commercial limitation. If royal-adjacent stories are what produce the largest spikes in engagement, then aligning content with those news cycles becomes a perfectly rational business strategy. But it also creates a different problem. It leaves the brand dependent on a news cycle that it neither controls nor independently generates. William's scone moment was never created to benefit As Ever. It happened on its own. As Ever simply benefited from arriving during the conversation that followed. The next William moment will arrive on its own timetable, driven by whatever he happens to do next that captures public attention. When that happens, the brand will once again face a decision about how to position itself around the resulting conversation. That is a reactive commercial position rather than a generative one. And that dependency, the reliance on royal-adjacent context to create peak engagement, is the real structural story of the entire Scone Week. Not whether the timing was intentional, not whether Angela Levin's interpretation of why these visual themes continue appearing is correct, not whether a lifestyle video involving jam and scones is secretly royal-inspired or simply a lifestyle video involving jam and scones. The deeper story is structural. A brand that was originally presented as independent from the royal world continues to generate its most discussed moments when it finds itself closest to that world. Meanwhile, William, the person who unintentionally started the entire conversation by joking with radio hosts about his grandmother's preferred scone order and later declining a phone call while celebrating a football victory, appears. Completely unaware that this broader commercial and reputational analysis is unfolding around him. And, in its own understated way, that may be the most revealing detail of the week. The individual whose actions generate some of the strongest reactions across the Sussex brand conversation is also the individual doing the least to intentionally create those reactions and the least aware they are happening. So, does the Scone episode represent a deliberate effort to remain connected to the royal conversation? Or is it simply a recurring pattern that naturally emerges when a brand occupies this particular cultural position and carries this particular history? There may never be a clean answer. But the pattern has now appeared across enough moments and enough months that it deserves consideration rather than being dismissed outright as coincidence. And it points toward a question that is worth thinking about. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Hollywood Today so you never miss our next deep dive. And if this kind of detailed analysis is why you watch, hitting the like button is one of the best ways to support the channel and help keep these conversations going. The next one is already on the way.